Hey everyone. Today we're going to be taking a look at a brand new plugin from a small developer called Lese, or Lese, or Less. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that. This plugin is called Codec, and it's a modern degradation plugin. I've been messing around with it for a little bit, and it has some really unique, cool features that I haven't seen in other plugins, so I figured I'd make a review of it and go over some of the controls. Overall, a pretty simple plugin, but it does some really unique stuff. Let's begin with packet loss rate. In Codec, the audio is split into packets, which are 10 to 20 milliseconds in length. As the loss rate increases, more and more of these packets will be affected by the loss algorithm selected. Loss type. This selects how the lost packets are treated and distributed. At random and smooth modes, the fashion in which the packets are distributed will be different. In the repeat mode, packets which are lost will be sampled and held, allowing for a glitchy effect. From my testing, the repeat mode is absolutely my favorite, and I think it's the most useful out of all of them. For random and smooth mode, you're going to notice very audible blips and dropouts, which is intentional, but it can be a little off-putting in certain applications. And bitrate. This controls the amount of size compression that the internal algorithm will attempt to reach. Internally, the amount of information that each packet contains will be reduced as this control is turned down. Now that we've gone over the controls in the first section of the plugin, let's mess around with them while testing it on this track. Start with random mode, increase loss. Very audible glitching. And no, that's not just my CPU dying, that's intentionally what the plugin's doing. Smooth mode. Okay, sounds a little bit smoother. Let's lower the bitrate. Bitrate is independent of the loss style selected. And here's my favorite mode, repeat. You can hear at higher loss percentages, you start to get a lot of glitches. But it can create some very unique movement at lower percentages. Now let's move on to this lower section here. First we have the bandwidth selection. The selector will influence the bandwidth that the internal algorithm will operate at. In auto mode, the algorithm will change itself to filter out any artifacts that might be generated by lower bit rates. I guess this is some sort of anti-aliasing, where on auto mode it will automatically detect some of the unwanted characteristics of the lowering of the bitrate and try to fix them. Let's mess around with bandwidth while changing the bitrate. Okay, there appears to be a little bit of a delay between when you set this bandwidth selection here and when it actually implements it. get some pretty big changes in the sound characteristics by messing with that bandwidth control. Next we have the crunch section. Crunch amount. This knob controls the amount of crunch distortion that will be introduced into the algorithm. Crunch frequency. This control adjusts the center frequency that the crunch distortion will be applied to. Crunch bandwidth. This controls the bandwidth of the crunch effect. At lower values, the distortion will take up a larger section of the spectrum. At higher values, it can be used to create resonances at the specifically defined crunch frequency. I was messing with this crunch section earlier, and you can create some really unique little resonance peaks, or much broader resonance peaks, while also having the bitrate reduction and the loss added into the effect. Overall, you can create some very unique sounds by using this. Now let's mess with the crunch section. As you increase the width function, it creates a much tighter resonance peak. You can hear the filter moving as I change the frequency control, but I believe that within the plugin, it intelligently adapts to the frequency that you have selected to not make it too aggressive. It's a really cool feature, and I haven't seen that in another plugin. Now let's try adding crunch with some bitrate reduction and loss. That's really cool. That sounds like some sort of retro drum machine that has a low sampling bitrate. Yeah, I really like that. Overall, I think Codec is a super unique and also very simple plugin that can create a very unique sound compared to other distortion and degradation plugins I've used. I'm really impressed with it, and I hadn't heard of this developer until a couple months ago when I saw Strum, but I think they're making some really cool stuff, and they're kind of filling in a unique niche in the music production and sound design areas. If you click on the Lese logo in your title bar, you can switch between a voice mode, a music mode, and a low latency mode. Each of these modes responds to incoming sounds a bit differently. I haven't even tried that yet. Let's give that a shot. Okay, everything on the plugin is set back to default. Now let's click the logo and see how it changes the characteristics of the plugin. Interesting, switching between these two modes, voice mode and music mode, it seems to impact the stereo width as well. Here's a note from the developer. One thing to note is that Codec does not feature a dry-wet mixer system. This is because the latency created by the internal compression algorithm can vary moment by moment, and having the latency compensation of the plugin host change constantly is not practical. We opted to ignore worrying about that altogether. We hope you understand. The lack of a dry-wet mixer system kind of makes sense to me for some of the unique stuff that Codec is doing with encoding and decoding, as well as the bitrate reduction and loss, especially loss. It would be very difficult to have them time-aligned, as in you're going to have a latency delay almost always with a plugin like this, and so I understand why they didn't implement that. Even if you were to run this on a parallel channel, I don't think it would be usable due to the delay compensation issues. I also want to mention, I really like this visualizer. I know it doesn't really add much to the plugin in terms of functionality, but I think it looks really cool, and it does change as you change the controls in the plugin to alter the sound. Here's just a little bit more about Codec. Codec comes from an idea we had for a plugin some time ago. What if you could simulate a bad internet connection? Looking around, we couldn't find that much that accomplished what we wanted. There were a few plugins that mimicked how this effect would sound, but they always seemed a little bit off. So we had another idea. What if we essentially build a plugin that worked as a container around the real thing, and we got to work? Codec is built around today's most common encoder-decoder system, Opus. It's the same algorithm that Discord and WhatsApp uses. And here's a little bit more detailed information about some of the features. Packet drop. Codec can simulate a poor internet connection through its use of its loss system, as well as how lost packets are handled. Packets can either be lost totally, and the internal algorithm will try to reconstruct your sound in real time, or they can be held and repeated for a super glitchy effect. That's the effect that I like most. Crunch. You can take Codec to its limits via the crunch section. Massive amounts of gain can be applied to the frequency section of your choosing, and then removed once compression and decompression have been completed, keeping your sound at the same volume but adding even more artifacts. Mode selection. The internal state of the algorithm can also be altered. I really like this plugin. I think it's just so unique, and it does some things that I've honestly never heard another plugin do. This is really cool, and they're giving it away for free. I'll leave a link to the plugin in the description. They have some other paid plugins you can check out as well as another free filter plugin, I believe, that's worth checking out. I'm super impressed by this, especially considering they're a small developer. I mean, this is just kind of out there, but also really cool. In terms of sound design, I could see this plugin even being more useful. If you're doing something like post-production and you want to emulate the sound of an internet connection breaking out for something like a voice call, this plugin would work perfectly. The only issue that I noticed using Codec is that even when it's put on a channel in its default setting, it increases the gain by about 4.5 to 5 decibels. It makes it difficult to compare, A to B in terms of loudness, and I would like to see this fixed in a future update of the plugin. I definitely would like to see them put maybe a small little gain knob up in the corner here. It might be impossible to implement it directly into the algorithms of the plugin to do makeup gain compensation, but I think it would be nice to have something on here so I wouldn't have to put an independent plugin after codec to bring the level down or push it up need be. Other than the gain issue, I didn't notice a single issue with codec. Thank you so much for checking out this video. Definitely go check out Lese Plugins and check out Codec. They have some really cool stuff, obviously, and I'm excited to try out some of their other plugins. So maybe I'll make reviews on those too if anybody's interested. Thanks a lot and have a good day.